near neighbor in space is much closer than we think. If I arrive there at say 80 kilometers an hour, the journey would take only 100 days. And because it's so close, its influence on our world is powerful. Which controls. So how did we come to have such a large and influential moon in the first place? And how has it dictated the course of all life on Earth? Depending on your way of life, the moon is seen as a frustrating enemy or as a helpful ally. Some animals hunt by moonlight. Others are at a disadvantage, easy prey to nocturnal predators. But for many creatures, the moon's influence is far-reaching. Over the course of evolution, it has helped shape not only the day-to-day pattern of their behavior, but also the monthly and annual rhythm of their lives. The moon also played a powerful role in the lives of our ancestors. With time, that relationship has changed, but not everywhere. For 3 nights in September, all eyes turn to the fire dragon as it snakes its way through the old quarter of Hong Kong. It's the traditional Chinese harvest time, when people gather to celebrate the rising of the autumn full moon. Throughout China, home to almost a quarter of the world's population, the moon is seen as a source of inspiration and great power. When the moon is full, they say, mankind and nature are as one. In today's cosmopolitan Hong Kong, they no longer plant and harvest rice according to the lunar cycle. But for young and old alike, the moon is still seen as a force to be respected and celebrated, in a way which we in the West have relegated to the realms of myth and history. Apart from Pluto, Earth is the only planet in our solar system to have a single large moon that's so close to its partner planet. Just 380,000 kilometers separate us from the moon, which has a diameter a quarter that of the Earth, and a surface area about the same as the continent of Africa. So far, only 12 men have walked on the moon, and in the wake of their missions, many of its mysteries have been resolved. But down on Earth, a full moon still turns heads. All around the world, the full moon is visible on the same night, 12 times a year, or occasionally, once in a blue moon, 13 times. The moon we see in Britain and the Northern Hemisphere is of course the same moon as they see down under. But there in the Southern Hemisphere, it appears upside down, with quite a different face to the man in the moon. And like the passage of the sun south of the equator, the moon moves across the Sydney skyline from right to left. The moon has no light of its own. Its glow is simply reflected sunlight. Half of it is always lit by the sun. But as it orbits the Earth, the segment of the lit surface that we see constantly changes. When the moon comes between us and the sun, it is new, and it then takes about 29 days, 1 lunar month, for the moon to wax to full and then wane to new once more. This creates the phases of the moon. Earth is a blue planet. 70% of its surface is covered by sea, and the influence of the moon and its phases is most conspicuous in this ocean world. Australia's Great Barrier Reef is the largest living structure on Earth. Along its entire length, the sexual rhythms of the corals are governed by the moon. Hundreds of coral species live as tiny polyps on the surface of the reef. To breed successfully, they must all spawn at the same time. The temperature of the sea and a very specific phase of the moon together synchronize this annual event almost to the hour. Precisely 5 days after the November full moon, coral eggs and sperm are released into the shallow sea above the living reef. A blizzard of coral spawn so plentiful that despite the many hungry predators, ample fertilized eggs survive and settle to become new coral polyps. At the same phase of the November moon, on the Pacific islands of Fiji and Samoa, pololo worms, tropical relatives of lugworms, release their male and female spawn in a mass of wriggling sacs. These rise to the surface, burst open, and discharge their potent contents. The sex life of the squid is also a lunar affair. Synchronized to meet by the light of the full moon, they mate on the seabed, lay their eggs, and then die. These horseshoe crabs are the closest living relatives of the trilobites. For 450 million years, creatures like these have hauled out of the sea onto beaches for their synchronized spawning. They have additional eyes on the top of their shells to detect ultraviolet light from the moon, and so help the adults keep track of the lunar cycles. But it's not just the light of the moon that orchestrates the birth of sea creatures. The moon has an even more powerful influence through its pull on the tides. The Grunion is a fish which breeds not in water but on land. On summer nights following either a full or a new moon, when the reach of the tide is highest, the adults leave the surf to spawn on beaches in Southern California. The fertilized eggs remain safely in the sand for 2 weeks until the next full or new moon, when they are swept into the sea and hatch. Sea turtles may take more than 30 years to reach sexual maturity and mate for the first time. They too need to lay their eggs on land. When the tide is rising, fertilized females haul out to excavate a nest and lay their eggs above the highest level of the tide, where they will incubate in the warm, dry sand. Over a period of several weeks, more and more turtles return to the beach of their own birth, to lay more clutches whenever the moon creates the best conditions for the survival of their offspring. Then, one night about 2 lunar months later, all the hatchlings of one clutch emerge in unison. Attracted to the moonlit sea, they head off into the shadows of the open ocean to start their precarious lives. The moon may well influence wildlife in ways beyond our comprehension. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, just south of the equator, is the island called Ascension. It is at first sight a barren, lifeless place, not unlike the moon itself. Its volcanoes first erupted from the bed of the ocean 1 million years ago, and its lava rocks still look hot and hostile. Ascension has strategic importance. This speck of land bristles with antennae and electronic ears, listening to the world. But it's also a strategic place for wildlife, especially seabirds. These are sooty terns. The species is known on Ascension as the wide-awake because of its distinctive noisy call. Each year, some 300,000 pairs return here from distant parts of the open ocean to mate and rear their young. In other parts of the world, sooty terns, like most other seabirds, are prompted to return to their ancestral breeding grounds when the days lengthen at the beginning of the summer. It's a response to the increasing hours of daylight. But here, on the equator, there is no distinct summer. The sun rises and sets at almost the same time every day of the year. There's no discernible change in the rhythm of the day and night. So what is it that brings these birds back to Ascension Island to breed? The only natural timescale between a day and a year is the lunar month. Could it be that the mass return of the sooty terns to Ascension is triggered in some way by the moon itself? These sooty terns are unusual in that they don't breed at the same time every year. It seems that their breeding cycle is linked to the lunar cycle. If one year they come in early June, the next they will return in mid-April, and the year after that in late February. The interval is 9.6 calendar months, exactly 10 lunar months. No one knows for sure, but perhaps these ocean birds have developed a genetic response that registers the passing of 10 full moons. But we do at least understand how the moon creates and controls the tides. Its gravitational pull on the oceans is so massive that it causes them to bulge upwards towards it, and conversely gives rise to a similar bulge on the opposite side of the world. As the Earth spins, these two bulges sweep across the oceans, creating high tides wherever they strike land. This twice-daily tidal rhythm is one of the most predictable events of nature, and around the globe dictates the pattern of life at the edge of the sea. Tides are greatest wherever the ocean is funneled inland, like here at the head of the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia, Canada. With each tide, a 14 billion-ton bulge of seawater surges across the mudflats. The sea level is raised by an average of 12 meters, and the highest spring tides reach 16 meters above the low water mark. As the Earth's spin takes the moon's gravitational pull away westwards over Canada, the tide retreats from the Bay of Fundy. On the opposite side of the world, in Western Australia, high tide has flooded into Talbot Bay, an almost landlocked inlet of the remote Kimberley coast. High headlands at the entrance create a narrow channel through which the tidal waters are forced to pass twice each day in both directions. The incoming tide swells the bay to bursting, and then when the tide turns, a colossal mountain of water pours out through the narrow channel, creating a salty waterfall of immense power. Here in Britain, the Severn estuary dividing England and Wales also acts like a funnel. It generates a tidal rise and fall that can exceed 12 meters, making it qualify as the third largest in the world. Britain's entire coastline is dramatically tidal. It is this that makes it attractive to wildlife, especially long-legged wading birds. These knot are waiting for the tide to turn. Like King Canute, after whom these Connaught were named, they are entirely subject to the dictates of the tide. Until the water retreats and exposes their muddy feeding grounds, they must bide their time. It's said that 1,000 years ago, King Canute tried to halt the tide here at Bosham Harbour on the Chichester estuary in Sussex. In truth, the Viking King of England was trying to show that as a mere mortal, his royal power was futile against that of nature. The pull of the moon on Bosham's tides hasn't changed, and the rise and fall of the estuary waters still shapes the daily life of this Sussex village. It's because our moon is so large and so close to Earth that its influence is so strong. The tides generated by the moon create a challenging environment, one that's exploited by species that have adapted to this ever-changing scene. Tide is in, barnacles and other creatures clinging to the rocks come out to feed on the bonanza of plankton stirred up by the swell. Anemones unfurl their tentacles to harvest fresh nutrients from the incoming tide. Limpets release their vice-like grip to graze algae from the submerged rocks. And fish leave their safe hiding places to forage out to sea, and in turn provide feasts for others. As the Earth spins and the moon's influence moves on, a frenzy of activity travels round the world. Land creatures venture out onto the exposed shore to feed on sea life stranded by the tide, before it's their turn to retreat as the restless tide returns. When beside the sea, we too are subject to the cycle of the tides. As the Atlantic moon swell reaches Britain and travels round the coast, it governs the comings and goings of holidaymakers on the beaches of our seaside resorts. The moon looks down on a world that, whether we know it or not, is still under the influence of a primordial rhythm. Not even Blackpool is immune. But there are still places by the sea where, like the wildlife, the local people are all too aware of their dependence on the lunar cycle. These ingenious fish traps stretch across the mouth of the Kosi River in Maputo land on the east coast of South Africa. Over centuries, the Tembi Tonga people have perfected this way of exploiting the natural harvest of the tidal zone. It's the men's task to spear fish trapped by the outgoing tide, while the women glean the shallows for delicacies like shellfish and sea urchins. Some days they can harvest redbait, an encrusting mass of tunicates which clings to crevices in the rocks at the extreme low water mark. For about half of each lunar month, this bountiful marine harvest is revealed, courtesy of the moon. These coastal people understand the power of the moon and how to harness it. When a child is born, they present it to the moon. The best time for this is when the moon is also new and about to start its cycle. They ask for it to provide for the child and give it protection from the daily dangers of the sea. For each child born into this coastal community, this ceremony is a rite of passage. These people of the sea seek the blessing of the moon as a guide who will watch over the child. To acknowledge the fickle control of the moon over their lives, the head woman chastises it by hurling a burning stick at its new crescent. Then the child is laid in the cooled embers of the fire. This is your moon, they declare. Long may its power protect you. Now with its own moon as patron, the child can safely begin a life harvesting the sea. When the moon is new or full, its pull on the tides is greatest. These extreme spring tides can be spectacular. This is the infamous Severn Bore. Several times a year, an exceptional high spring tide reverses the flow of the River Severn, creating a moving wall of seawater 2 meters high that surges far inland. On the other side of the Atlantic, a similar event happens on the River Amazon, but on a huge scale. Traveling hundreds of kilometers upriver, the Amazon's tidal bore scours the banks of its tributaries, leaving devastation in its wake. But the world's most remarkable tidal bore takes place in China, on the river Qiantang, which reaches the sea just south of Shanghai. At the autumn equinox, around the 18th day of the 8th lunar month of the Chinese calendar, an extremely high spring tide, assisted by seasonal winds, piles up the water into the mouth of the river. This annual event attracts a daring crowd. Known traditionally as the Black Dragon, it has claimed many lives, as warriors and boats have tried to ride the monster. Outrunning it is still a daredevil sport for local young men. This tidal wave can rise up almost 9 meters and reach a speed of 40 kilometers an hour before being subdued by the coastal defenses. Qiantang's ferocious black dragon then returns to the sea. Australia is Earth's oldest continent and is home to some of the most ancient forms of life on the planet. But it was not until some 50 or 60,000 years ago that the first people arrived here. With them, they brought a basic knowledge of the workings of our planet. Myths and legends filled the gaps in their understanding. The old lady teaches her grandchildren about the moon. He is a strict taskmaster, she says, but one who will bring you good fortune if you behave. In Aboriginal Dreamtime stories, the moon features as the husband of all women, for it is he that controls their sexual cycle tied to the lunar month. The moon endows the great gift of fertility on the earth, to its people and to all other living things. As it moves through the sky, it creates a natural clock and and governs the fortunes of the hunter and the fisherman. Aborigines that live by the sea say that when the moon dies, in its place a new one is born from the shell of a nautilus. For them, the moon in its renewal holds hope of life after death. The Apollo missions of the late 60s and early 70s that took men to the moon gave us a more complete picture of our nearest neighbor in space and solved some of its mysteries. For the first time, men looked down on the far side of the moon, the dark side that faces away from Earth.
30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 30 seconds. Tranquility base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. One small step for man. One giant leap for mankind. Boy, it's really rolling hills, Joe. Just like 14 up and down we go.
But perhaps the greatest revelation was the view of planet Earth rising above the lunar horizon. It gave us a new perspective on our home.
God saw that it was good. But it looked like
The astronauts brought back moon rocks, from which scientists have only recently confirmed how the moon itself was formed. We now know that its origin was back on Earth. Travel back in time 4.5 billion years to the dawn of our solar system. The sun has been shining for almost 1 billion years, and already planet Earth is in orbit, red hot and still largely molten. But it is not alone. It has a sister planet called Theia, following a similar path around the sun, a path that inevitably brings the two on collision course. The impact of these two massive objects would have looked like slow motion. But in fact, Theia struck Earth at almost 50,000 kilometers an hour, turning the two planets into molten rock and hurling debris and gases into space. At its peak, the fireball was brighter than the sun. $20 billion cubic kilometers of molten rock were propelled into orbit round the Earth. And in under 10 years, this massive ring of minerals and gases coalesced to form our moon. From this cataclysmic creation, the Earth and the moon began their remarkable partnership. But at the beginning, no more than 30,000 kilometers separated them. Hundreds of millions of years, the enormous gravitational pull of a moon so close created massive tides in the molten lava erupting from the Earth. The first seas that eventually formed were constantly in turmoil from the tidal pull of the nearby moon. It was a force 1,000 times greater than it is today. And with the Earth spinning much faster, these tidal waves surged over the newly formed crust, cooling and solidifying the molten magma. This was the crucible from which the surface of the Earth was formed, and with it, the seas which became the cradle of life. In all this, the catalyst was the moon. Without it, the story of life on Earth would have been very different. There may have been no life at all. These limestone structures are stromatolites, among the oldest living things on Earth. They were first laid down by primitive algae which evolved in shallow seas 3.5 billion years ago. The violent seas had begun to calm, but the moon was still large in the sky, appearing many times bigger than today. Its now solid surface reflected sunlight which was dazzlingly brilliant at full moon. The algae absorbed sunlight and moonlight, producing bubbles of oxygen day and night, which over the course of another 2 billion years created our atmosphere, turning the sky blue. Vast colonies of these algae dominated the seas around the world until they had collectively generated enough oxygen for animal life to evolve. In these brightly moonlit seas, the chain reaction of evolution was ignited and led to the prolific variety of life we know today. Life has come a long way from those primordial times when together the moon and the earth shaped our destiny. As the spin of the earth slowed down, the moon moved away, and its influence dwindled. But we're still attracted by its simple beauty. It's at full moon that we are most aware of its presence and feel its pull. In quite recent times, the full moon was associated with werewolves and demons. In some people it brought out malign tendencies. But crimes committed at full moon were dealt with more leniently. Lunacy was considered part of people's nature, deep-rooted in the human psyche. Maybe there was a time in the human story when, like the wolf, our ancestors hunted by the light of the full moon. It was then that their bloodlust was at its peak. As time went by, society was encouraged to give up this aggressive way of life. But we perhaps still fear that there is a vestige of the wolf in all of us. The full moon rises over Manhattan. It's June. The air is thick and temperatures are rising. This full moon, claim the New York police, brings out extreme behavior in people and a rise in crime and accidents. Medics and fire crews, prison warders and even midwives brace themselves for a busy night. It seems that you needn't be insane or a lunatic to be touched by the moon. How the moon can directly affect us defies scientific explanation. But we all have anecdotes that support the claim. Could it be that in all life there is an innate response to the moon? One that harks back to a much earlier time in the story of the Earth. In May 2003, the Isle of Lewis in Scotland witnessed an annular eclipse of the sun. It was a rare celestial event that had been forecast long ago. The moon and the sun rose almost together, the sun moving faster until the two exactly coincided, creating a magnificent fiery ring, as the Earth, the moon and the sun came into precise alignment. Those few who saw it agreed that it was one of the most inspiring events in their lives. People first came to Lewis and the other islands of the Outer Hebrides almost 6 millennia ago. The many standing stones they laboriously erected, like these at Callanish, are testament to their successful way of life, a hard-working community of farmers who respected and exploited the power of nature. In the outline of the hills to the south of Callanish, they saw the form of a woman lying on her back, an Earth Mother. Local people still call her Sleeping Beauty, and every 18.5 years she figures in an extraordinary lunar event that was first observed by those prehistoric settlers. They passed on their knowledge in stone. The main stones at Callanish are aligned almost north to south, but their main focus is not the sun. The builders of this sacred site accurately predicted the cycles of the moon, not just its monthly phases, but its movement through the heavens over the course of the entire year, and far beyond that. The stones are set out rather like a moon dial, to predict when the moon will reach its lowest position in the sky. This happens every 18.5 years, when the Earth and the Moon return to the same configuration. It's then that the full moon rises from behind the Sleeping Beauty and rolls along her body, before disappearing behind the higher hills, plunging Callanish back into darkness. Then, half an hour later, the moon reappears through a glacial valley to the south and fleetingly illuminates the stones again. It's said that at this moment, the Earth Mother faithfully appears to the moon watchers of Callanish. Throughout the world, the moon is a symbol of good fortune. It brings fertility and endows the seas with a boundless productivity. It acts as a calendar in all our lives and imposes a vital rhythm on the entire natural world. Our nearest neighbor in space is seen as a benevolent force for good, one that has shaped the nature of our planet. It is a partnership to be celebrated. In the vast, chaotic scheme of things, the creation of our moon was both extraordinary and fortunate. Without this accident of nature, where on earth would we be now?
So